right. I am Ben Burgis. This is Give Them an Argument. I am joined once again by Victor Brazone and Ethan from the Confronting Capital YouTube channel, and they're both from the Academic Edgelords podcast with our friends Matt McManus and Gordon Katic. I'm actually just back like a few days from staying with Matt for a week in Detroit. But in any case,
did you guys end up meeting up?
Yeah,
you and Ethan though?
Oh no!
It's a different thing.
No,
Sorry.
I mean this is actually, you know, you're really putting him on the spot here. I don't know what happened.
I thought you were going to. I thought I remember you saying something like, "I'll send you an itinerary." I didn't even know you'd come to Michigan yet. I didn't know you were. I didn't know when. I just knew sometime in March.
Okay, I did give you the date and time and everything for the talk. So
over text or in a call. If it was in a call, I must have.
This is such an inappropriate.
Sorry.
I don't remember.
Yeah, no. It's fair enough, right?
Anyway,
but
so how was times with Matt? Good times.
Good times with Matt. Did like a little presentation for this Hegel reading group he does in Ann Arbor on Wednesday night and last week, and then on Thursday, like in the afternoon, I did a guest lecture in his class, and which was a lot of fun. I mean, I kind of feel like it's like a little bit like the way that you're, grandparents can spoil the kids in a way that the parents can't, right? Because they don't have to deal with them afterwards. I felt like since it wasn't my class and I don't feel that much responsibility about, the sort of professional norms of this, I mean, I could like talk a bit more smack about the various like right-wing authors he'd have them read, for balance than he'd be able to. So yeah, no, that was fun. And then that night I did the Palestine talk for Metro Detroit DSA and Wayne State University YDSA, which was good. It's a shame that we couldn't find anybody in Detroit to record it, but it's possible. It sounds like there's a good chance we'll be doing it in a version of the same thing in LA late next month, and should not be a problem here to find someone with a camera. So then we can, put it on YouTube, inshallah. But
nice.
I don't know. I made Matt watch a couple of the Nightmare on Elm Street movies, so I feel like that's some kind of contribution to his cultural, development.
I'm sure Matt liked it. I feel like he loves I feel like he likes that kind of pop cultural stuff, He's a simple man of simple pleasures, I feel like.
Fair enough. No,
I didn't mean for that to sound so like
no.
Look, I feel like he would admit it too.
I'm a simple man of simple pleasures. That's fine.
Yeah,
but yeah, no, we watched number 3, which he'd never seen either of these, but we watched number 3, which like everybody likes, and number 4, which is I have a huge soft spot for, but I'll acknowledge is just okay. But So this is I don't remember which of you guys suggested this, but we're gonna watch Destiny.
Probably me.
Jordan Peterson's podcast. Which it's kind of funny, because like I did 2 debates with Destiny back in 2019. And since then, he really hasn't been like that much on my radar for the most part. And I'll also admit that like it was much easier for me to think vaguely positive thoughts about him before the last 6 months, where I think he's been, just kind of unbelievably bad. on Israel Palestine. But yeah, I've also ended up watching quite a bit more of his stuff lately than I have in a while, right? Because like we did the thing, you know, the two of you and I watched the clusterfuck debate.
Oh yeah,
him and
with Alex Jones
and Glenn Greenwald and like I feel like one or two other people. It was a whole thing, but
yeah,
the
Krasensteins.
The Krasensteins, yes, of course, right? Who could forget? Yeah. And then I actually still have not made time to watch the 5 hours of Lex Friedman. I've seen people talk about, you know, very little else for a long time, but like I just kind of can't imagine just watching that on my own. Like if I wasn't doing like a debate breakdown, if it's just like me sitting on my couch watching TV, right? I have a very hard time imagining. Be like, you know what I'm gonna do for the next 5 hours?
Yeah, I tried watching some of that, and I think the thing that I find like so boring about the Israel-Palestine debates lately, I mean, part of it's just the fact that I don't know enough to like get into the super nuances, but they start arguing about certain empirical or historical claims that are like super like I don't know. I mean, they matter, but they're just like very kind of inside baseball. Like what happened at this point? How do we understand like who the aggressor was when this happened back in 1960, whatever? And I'm just like, fuck, I have no idea about any of this stuff. So it's like I got a little lost, you know, watching it myself. But I will say my favorite part of the debate of what came out of it is like all the memes about Finkelstein like mispronouncing Destiny's last name because his name's Stephen Bonnell, and he kept calling him like Stephen, like Bonelli, Morelli,
which is really funny actually, because like I had I mean, look, that is pretty funny. I mean, I know Norm a little bit. He's been a guest on the show several times. I like the guy a lot. You know, I don't think he himself would be that offended by, you know, the observation that he's a bit of an eccentric old man, right? You know, and and you know, I don't even think that was on purpose. Probably, I think
I don't think so.
Yeah,
I don't think so. But I love it became a meme, and I noticed that on the comments of this video that we're about to watch, all like everyone is like saying like, oh, this is a really good debate between Peterson and Mr. Botticelli.
It's actually also really funny because I had you know, I'd seen there were people. So I'd seen there were people, I think including Destiny himself, or he was certainly signal boosting it, who had after the debate had like dug up stuff about like personal stuff about Norm, which none of which like particularly surprised me. It's like, you know, I don't know, like cranky, elderly, you know, Jewish person of a certain personality and vintage, you know, like gets into feuds with neighbors. It's not really like a, you know, I'm unshocked, right? But like in case, in fact, I'm pretty sure Norm has complained about those same neighbors like on the street. Like,
yeah, I've heard him do it. Yeah.
So like, yeah, sure, right? Like, not that surprising. Also, very not relevant. So I posted something like, "Oh, I haven't seen this yet because it's 5 hours long." But the fact that people are, you know, like if anybody's like digging up dirt about Norm that clearly has nothing to do with anything, this is. You know, it's that's like seems like they don't really have a good response to what he said in the thing itself. And got Destiny, who I haven't really interacted with in a very long time, but he had this like really angry quote tweet of that where he was like, you know, where he's like, oh, I see, you know, if he insults me, that's, you know, epic. But like, you know, if I dig up dirt on him, that shows I'm wrong. And like, I can't win either way. It's like, when did I ever say it was epic? When have I ever used the word epic? Like, you know, literally ever in my life, right? I mean, I don't talk like that. You know, this is, you know, like the thing about claims of inconsistency or hypocrisy is it really does need to be the same person saying both things. Right, because if it's just like you say X and people who agree with you on a lot of things say not X, that's not really enough to make anybody inconsistent yet.
Yeah.
But I did watch, because it was a lot shorter than that one, I did watch his debate with Nathan Robinson. And I actually saw that Nathan has a article today that he published in Current Affairs about that debate. It's called "My Date with Destiny," and in it, I've got to say, he does, having, as I've been saying, watched more of more of the guy's content lately than I have in a long time. He does say something that I've got to say kind of resonates with my frustration with the whole sort of style of debate that he really represents, right? So he was talking about how the debate came to be, and it says, "I was not eager to do this. While Destiny appears not to have read a single full book on the Israel-Palestine conflict, he's a formidable opponent in one-on-one conversations. He's very, very aggressive and a quick thinker. I find his moral positions horrifying, and many of his factual statements are erroneous, but more than one person has been embarrassed in an argument with him. I don't think his style is conducive to serious, intelligent discussion because he speaks so fast that you can barely think, interrupts constantly, and appears more interested in, quote, destroying, unquote, you than in taking what you have to say seriously. In those kinds of conditions, the opposing party is likely to blurt out whatever pops into their head without being able to give it much thought. That's great if the goal is to make them look foolish or erupt in dumb rage, but it's not really a good way to learn anything. I'm a writer and a slow thinker who likes to revise my thoughts before offering them to the public. Fast-paced debate is something I usually don't care for. Because inevitably I say something ill-considered in the moment and then realize later what the right answer was, which I've got to say did all resonate with me. That I think that that there is something. I obviously think that real-time debate has a lot of virtues, and it's obviously a thing that I enjoy watching. This is the millionth of these things I've done, and I even enjoy participating in if it's done the right way. But that does capture something I'm often very frustrated about watching this stuff, and I think it does connect to what Victor said too, right? Because it's if you're doing super snappy back and forth, it's very easy to go down these rabbit holes where it's all about oh, well, was there some violence at the Great March of Return? When did it happen? Is it before or after? As they have when is the first rocket fired from Gaza? Whatever. That oftentimes, it's really this game of who can hold a position on one of these really fine-grained details the longest, and the actual issues that matter most in dispute really get lost, right? If I were talking to him about this, the point I'd really want to press on is look, is it okay to rule over people for decades without giving them citizenship in your state, right? Is that just okay as a matter of general principle? Is there anything that could be true about what happened at Camp David or Taba or whatever that would justify that, right? And this is, because I think talking about principles and inferences and all that stuff is often really helpful in a way that just sort of talking about whatever the last claim your interlocutor made that you think you can show is wrong is often really, really not helpful.
Yeah, I agree.
But
I don't know, Ethan, do you want to say something more substantive than me?
No, I agree. I think, I think in-person debate has its virtues, especially if you're arguing with somebody who's I find that in-person debate is most helpful when your interlocutor is just sort of somebody who's kind of weaselly and just actually does need to just sort of be pinned down on a point. Okay, don't give me a paragraph, just answer this question, please. Somebody who's just kind of gonna snake around. But I think that in general, if it's In general, I mean, I think that like a written debate or something like that, like where you have more time to sort of like carefully consider what you say before saying it, is probably going to produce a more, like intellectually fruitful exchange. At least as the two people engaging are sufficiently like honest and competent or whatever.
I would also say that like, I mean, look, I think like verbal real time. I mean, again, there are like advantages to that, but but I also think there's a range, right? Like, are you going to do like the kind of verbal real time debate where there's a moderator and it's like relatively clear whose turn is to talk when, and best of all, there's an actual time limit, so you don't just keep talking until somebody runs out of steam. Or are you going to do it in ways that meet none of those conditions? Like that's like a pretty important distinction. Or like, do you, even like, and even with what you were saying just now, right? It's like, look, I agree that like people being weaselly is a problem, but also like something that definitely frustrated me in the Destiny Nathan Robinson one is that there were points where it's like he's asking questions that have some like pretty complicated assumptions built into them, and then when the answer is so no, why won't you just tell me yes or no?
Yeah.
Oh man, don't do that.
Yeah, I think like Jesse Lee Peterson is a great exemplification of like the farthest extreme of that strategy. It's like, do you love black people? It's like, oh, I love everyone. No, do you love black people?
Yeah, I think that was literally one of the questions he asked me.
Yeah, he asks it quite frequently.
My answer was maybe sure. You love black guys. Like every single one of them. I don't particularly love you. I don't. But yeah, I will say that said, I actually expect that, even with Destiny, I feel like in some of the stuff I've watched by him lately, which definitely tilts toward the Israel-Palestine stuff because he's been doing so much of that. I think that because he can talk so fast when he wants to, and he often seems so angry and annoyed about that topic, I think you kind of get the worst version of him in that. I actually suspect, and I'm not saying he's not going to say lots of things that I think are ridiculous because I do, right? But like, I actually suspect that Jordan Peterson, of all people, might bring out like a better version of him because Peterson doesn't talk particularly fast. He's probably not going to feel super comfortable like berating or interrupting him. So like, that might actually get like a more slowed down, interesting, version of, Mr. Borelli. And I do, it's not like I think that he's a dumb guy, right? Like that's, like they have several complaints, but that's not one of them, right? And I actually also think that probably a lot of things that he's right about would even come out in a conversation with Jordan Peterson, although maybe I'll be proven wrong.
Well, let's see.
Yeah.
I'm pleased to announce my new tour for 2024. Beginning in early February and running through June.
Yeah, you can skip this. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. I'm here today talking to Stephen Bunnell, known professionally and online as Destiny. He's an American streamer, debater, and political commentator. He really came to my attention, I would say, as a consequence of the discussion he had with Ben Shapiro and Lex Friedman. And I decided to talk to him, not least because it's not that easy to bring people who are identified, at least to some degree, with the political beliefs on the left into a studio where I can actually have a conversation with them. I've tried that more often than you might think. And it happens now and then, but not very often. So today we talk a lot about, the differences between the left and the right and the dangers of political ideology per se and the use of power as opposed to invitation and all sorts of other often heated and contentious issues. And so you're welcome to join us. And I was happy to have the opportunity to do this. So I guess we might as well start by letting the people who don't know who you are get to know who you are with a little bit more precision. So why have you become known and how has that developed?
It's a pretty broad question. I think I started streaming around 15 years ago when it wasn't really a thing yet. There were a few people that did it. I started early on. I guess back then you weren't a professional gamer yet because the game had just started to come out, but there was a game called StarCraft 2, and I streamed myself playing that game. I was a pretty good player. It was pretty entertaining to watch. And then I kind of grew over, I guess, maybe the next 7 years, just streaming that people would watch.
Streaming on YouTube?
Well, back then, I started on a website called Livestream. Then I switched to Ustream. Then I switched to a site called Justin TV. And then that turned into Twitch.tv. So after streaming there for like 7 or 8 years, I was a semi-professional StarCraft 2 gamer. That game kind of came and went, but I had a lot of other interests. Around 2016, I started to get more involved into the world of politics. It's kind of a left-leaning figure because of my background in like esports and internet gaming and internet trash talk. I had more of a kind of like a combative attitude, and that was kind of rare for left-leaning people at the time. So it's basically where my early political popularity came from. I think from like 2016 to 2018 was debating right-wing people.
So was there a game-like element to the debating, do you think? And is that part of why that morphing made sense?
No, I wouldn't say so. I mean, if you get really reductionist, everything in life is kind of a game, but that's not very satisfying. I think I grew up like very argumentative. My mom is from Cuba, so my family was like very conservative. And then I grew up like listening to the news all day, listening to my mom's political opinions all day. And then I argued with kids in high school and everything. And I've always been kind of like an argumentative, type A, aggressive personality. So I think that probably lent itself well to the political stuff in 2016. Yeah.
Was that useful in gaming? That personality?
In some ways, yeah. In some ways, no. I don't know directly for the games itself. I don't know how much it necessarily mattered. But for all the peripheral stuff, in some ways it was really beneficial. I could kind of like cut out my own path and I could be very unique and I could kind of be on my own. In some ways it was very detrimental. I can be very difficult to get along with. And I'm very much kind of like, I want to do this thing. And if you try to tell me what to do, I don't want to have like a sponsor or a team or anybody kind of with a leash on me. So yeah, I guess it worked out.
It's interesting because the temperamental proclivity that you're describing, that's associated with low agreeableness. And generally, and that's more combative, it's more stubborn, it's more implacable, it's more competitive. The downside is that it's more skeptical, it can be more cynical, it can be less cooperative. But generally a temperament like that is not associated with political belief on the left, because the leftists tend to be characterized by higher levels of compassion, and that's low agreeableness. So, that element of your temperament at least is quite masculine, and a lot of the ideology that characterizes the modern left has a much more temperamentally feminine nature. So all right. So why do you think the shift from your popularity to political commentary worked? And you said that started about 2016. And why do you think that shift happened for you, like in terms of your interest?
I think I've always been interested in a lot of things. Like I grew up with a very strong political bend. It was conservative until I got into my streaming years, probably 5 or 6 years into streaming. I slowly kind of started to shift to the left. I would say that, I guess in around 2016, when I saw all of the conversations going on with the election and when all the issues being talked about, I felt like the conversations were very low quality. And in my naivety, I thought that maybe I could come in and boost the quality, at least in like my little corner of the internet, to have better conversations about what was going on. And so that was basically my injection point into all of that was, fighting about those political issues and then arguing with people about them, doing research and reading and all of that. Yeah.
And so did you do that by video to begin with as well?
Yeah, it was all streaming. Yeah.
It was all streaming. And so I presume you built an audience among the people who were following you as a gamer first, and then that started to expand. Is that correct?
Basically, yeah. Without getting too much into like the business or streaming side of things, basically, actually, this probably carries over to basically to all media, I would imagine, is you've got people that will watch you for special events. So maybe you're like a commentator of the Super Bowl, or maybe you're hosting like a really huge event. Then you've got people who will watch you every time you're participating in your area of expertise. So for me, that's like a particular game I might be playing. It might be when you're on like a particular show or something that people watch you for. And then the fundamental fan, like the best fan that you're converting to the lowest and most loyal viewer, I guess, is somebody that's watching you basically no matter what you're doing. And these are the people that'll follow you from area to area. Right. And I think because of the way I did gaming and I talked about a lot of other stuff, whether it was politics, science, current events, whatever, I had a lot of loyal fans that kind of followed me wherever I went. So quite a few of them stuck in StarCraft.
Established a reputation.
Yeah.
So how would you characterize your reach now? How would you quantify it?
I think well, can you be more precise?
How many people are watching a typical video that you might produce, and what are you doing for subscribers, say on YouTube, and total? Any idea about total reach?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess my subscribers on YouTube, I have around, I think that's around 770,000 on my main channel. I think I probably do between all three channels, I think around 15 to 20 million views a month. And then I live stream to anywhere from 5 to 15,000 concurrent viewers a day for hopefully around 8 hours a day. Yeah.
Okay. So you have quite a substantial reach. And so you said that initially you were more conservative leaning, but that changed. What did it mean that you were more conservative leaning, and how and why did that change?
When I said I was conservative leaning, I mean, I was writing articles for my school newspaper defending George Bush and the Iraq War. I was like very much like, I think it's like an insult now when people say like neocon, but I was like very much like a conservative, a Bush era conservative. So supported big business, supported traditional, all of the conservative, I guess, like foreign policy, hawkish foreign policy, for whatever that meant as like a 14, 15-year-old.
Right.
There was the whole Elian Gonzalez incident that was very big for Cuban Americans, where there was a Cuban boy that tried to come to the United States with several other people and his mother, and their raft, I guess, crashed or something happened. I think his mom died and some other people died, and there was a huge debate on whether or not to send him back to Cuba, and Clinton ended up sending him back to Cuba. And I know that my mom was super irritated and all that, to say the least. And then once I hit college, I think I supported Ron Paul in 2008. So I was a big Ron Paul libertarian guy in high school. When I went to a Catholic Jesuit high school, and I kind of became atheist in that process. I started reading Ayn Rand. So I was very, 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 very conservative.
But on the libertarian end,
I would say so. Yeah. Initially on the
that makes more sense in relationship to your temperament.
Sure, maybe. Yeah. Initially it was like Christian conservative, and then it became like libertarian conservative. Without my life kind of took like a wacky path. And then as I started working, I kind of had to drop out of school. I was working, and then I got into streaming. And once I started streaming, I had a son basically around the first year I started streaming. As I started to go through life, and I went from kind of being in this like working poor position to making a lot of money, especially through the lens of my child, I saw how different life was when I had more money versus less. And I guess like the differences between what was available to me and then my child, as I made more money while I was really wealthy versus not as wealthy, it kind of started to change the way that I guess.
So you got more attuned to the consequences of inequality?
Basically, I would say, yeah.
Okay, and so how did that lead you to develop more sympathy for left-leaning ideas, particularly?
I guess my core beliefs have never really changed, but I think the way that those become applied kind of change. So much the same way that you might think that everybody deserves a shot to go to school and have an education. That might be like a core belief, where as a libertarian or conservative, I might think that as long as a school is available, everybody's got the opportunity to go and study. But maybe now as like a liberal or progressive or whatever you'd call me, I might say, okay, well, we need to make sure that there's enough, maybe like food in the household or some kind of funding program to make sure the kid can actually go to school and study, basically. So like the core drive is the same, but I think the applied principle ends up changing a bit based on what you
right.
think.
So is your concern essentially something like the observation that if people are bereft enough of substance, let's say, that it's difficult for them to take advantage of equal opportunities, even if they are presented to them, let's say?
Yeah, essentially, yeah.
And you have some belief, and correct me if I'm wrong, you have some belief that there is room for state intervention at the level of basic provision to make those opportunities more manifest.
Yeah, to varying degrees, yeah.
Okay. So let's start talking more broadly then on the political side. So how would you characterize the difference, in your opinion, between the left and the conservative political viewpoints?
On a very, very, very broad level, if there's some, I would say if there's some like good world that we're all aiming for, I think people on the left seem to think that a collection of taxes from a large population that goes into a government that's able to precisely kind of dole out where that tax money goes. You're basically able to take the problems of society. You're able to scrape off, hopefully, not super significant amount of money from people that can afford to give a lot of money, and then through government programs and redistribution, you target those taxes essentially to people that kind of need whatever bare minimum to take advantage of opportunities in society. Yeah.
Okay.
And then on the conservative end, I guess a conservative would generally think that, why would the government take my money? I think from a community point of view, through churches, through community action, through families, we can better allocate our own dollars to our own friends and family to help them and give them the things that they need so that they can better participate in and thrive in society, basically.
Okay, so one of the things that I've always found a mystery, I mean, I think there's an equal mystery on the left and on the right in this regard, is that the more conservative types tend to be very skeptical of big government, and the leftist types tend to be more skeptical of big corporations. Right? Well, following through the logic that you just laid out, you made the suggestion that one of the things that characterizes people on the left is the belief that government can act as an agent of can and should act as an agent of distribution. Okay, a potential problem for that is the gigantism of the government that does that. Now, the conservatives are skeptical of that gigantism. And likewise, the liberals, the progressives in particular, we'll call them progressives, are skeptical of the reach of gigantic corporations. And I've always seen a commonality in those two, in that both of them are skeptical of gigantism. And so one of the things that I'm concerned about, generally speaking, with regard to the potential for the rise of tyranny, is the emergence of giants. And one potential problem with the view that the government can and should act as an agent of redistribution is that there is an incentive put in place, two kinds of incentives. Number one, a major league incentive towards gigantism and tyranny. And number two, an incentive for psychopaths who use compassion to justify their grip on power, to take money and to claim that they're doing good. And I see that happening everywhere now, particularly in the name of compassion. And it's one of the things that's made me very skeptical, in particular about the left, and at least about the progressive edge of the left. So I'm curious about what you think about.
Yeah, we've been going for a while. This seems like as good a time as any to pause and talk about it. There were several people in the chat who were joking about how this really seemed like a therapy intake session, and definitely the body language and the sort of pattern of who's talking the most, all that definitely does have that feel to it, I have to say. But they are finally, I think, getting a little bit into something real. So I do have some stuff to say about this, but you guys have any thoughts?
So it seems like the first sort of substantive political argument that Jordan Peterson made is that if you let the government get bigger, one is he says there's, leftists are skeptical of corporations and right-wingers are skeptical of governments. And I don't think that's exactly right as a distinction between left and right. Because I mean, of course, if you look at libertarian leftists, libertarian socialists, they're going to be skeptical of both big government and big corporations. And to the extent that they support things like welfare, you'll hear Chomsky talk about this. It's basically okay, the government is an evil, but it's one that in our current circumstance, we can sort of use to keep corporations in check to some extent. But ultimately, we don't want big government either. But also, he makes this point about how if you have more government interference in the economy, etc., you're going to get more corruption, basically, seems to be his concern. And he can think of some sort of mechanistic reasons why we would expect that. And I mean, it's worth noting that like, well, you can think of sort of obvious mechanisms why having a bigger government could lead to more corruption. Like, there are also sort of plausible mechanisms on the other side. Like, one that I've heard mentioned is like, you know, like if more people's money is being, you know, held by the government, redistributed by the government, people are going to have like more of an incentive to pay attention to the government and what the government is doing, because it's like, hey, you know, that's my money, so I'm going to, you know, be more diligent in you know, monitoring how the government is using my money. And then as just like an empirical question, I mean, the research that I've done on this, because I remember looking up a lot of stuff about this a while back, and it seems to be the case that at least among democracies, bigger governments in terms of like how much of the economy they control, etc., having a bigger government is actually tends to be correlated with having a less corrupt government, although that association breaks down for non-democracies.
Right.
Yeah, I don't have that many thoughts beyond what Ethan just said, but I mean, I think obviously most of what we've seen was kind of an interview, right? It wasn't really a debate yet. It was like, you know, Jordan Peterson just asking him questions, and then Destiny started talking about his background and where he's coming from. But yeah, I mean, I think as this develops, I think we'll get to see, because I you know, full disclosure, I did watch, I think I had this on in the background like last week, I think, when it first came out, so I've kind of watched it, but not really. And you know, all I can say is it's, you know, I think it's going to get a lot worse than this in terms of kind of Peterson's. Yeah, I mean, I always just start cringing as soon as Peterson starts talking about politics, because, you know, I just feel like his understanding of the way that he divides the world is I mean, it's just clear, but he talks with the same authority as if he's talking about psychology. It's like, that's just such a problem.
Yeah, and he mixes them together. You know, we got you know, like he very like calmly and confidently said a few minutes ago that, you know, science tells us that left-wing beliefs are very girly, whereas right-wing beliefs are very manly.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, you know, that's essentially what you said. It's like, oh wow, that's science. Science tells you that. All right. But to me, where it actually got a little bit interesting was when it was still very interviewee, or again very therapy intakey. That when Destiny starts to describe his political evolution, I mean, like, okay, you know, my first thought was when he said he used to be a neocon. It's like, wow, man, really back to your roots the last few months.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But like then he said something that, you know, definitely made me think much more positive thoughts about him, which was that, you know, having a child at the same time that he was making more money, and thinking about the difference, you know, that made to his life and the different opportunities that his child would have compared to him, you know, like made him, you know, I mean, they're using the word left here in a way that I don't love, but whatever, right? You know, just to like adopt that, right? You know, like made him move to the left from where he was. It's like, okay, that's actually kind of, you know, that's good. But then like when he starts to like really explain it, it really seems like his whole justification for redistribution is some kind of pretty shallow equality of opportunity principle, that like, okay, it's not just good enough, this was his example, to make sure that everybody can go to school. You also need to make sure they're like, you know, getting enough food at home and all that stuff to, you know, to make sure that they can fully take advantage of that opportunity. It's like, yeah, fair enough. You know, obviously no argument with any of that, but like, but it still seems to assume that inequality is only bad to the extent that it's linked to this like pretty narrow notion of equality of opportunity, right? Like everybody has a shot of going through the education system and climbing some career ladder, and, you know, and having like a good life from like a middle-class profession, which seems to me like, I mean, I guess there are different ways you could push this, but it seems to me like a really narrow and unsatisfying notion of equality. And one way to think about it, right, because this is a discussion, how debatey it gets, I suppose, remains to be seen with Jordan Peterson, is that...
Oh, it's going to get contentious, don't worry.
Okay, good. So is that like Peterson is like much worse on this than Destiny is, but there's like a spectrum, and I think Destiny's position isn't really as far away from Peterson's as I would ultimately like. So Peterson's classic thing, you can go back, and this is something that's always bugged me, like when I started, I mean, in some ways kind of what led to everything else I'm doing is that back in 2018, I spent way too much time like arguing with friends and relatives about Jordan Peterson. And that kind of morphed into, all the public facing stuff. And, the first like video on YouTube of me is of this like talk that I gave in 2018 at a conference that's about Jordan Peterson. One of the points I'm making here is that it's like Peterson's always saying, it's like one of his big like core things. Oh, equality of opportunity, that's great, it's noble, but quality of outcome, that's bad, right? That leads straight to the gulag. But it seems like there are many objections you could make to that, but one of the most obvious objections is, which to be fair, I do think Destiny has kind of gotten this far, is, well, hold on, but are those two things really unrelated to each other, right? Like, don't one generation's outcomes become the next generation's opportunities? But then the problem is, it's like, look, ultimately, what kind of society do you want, right? I mean, is it just like, are you sort of satisfied if everybody has whatever you would consider to be a reasonable shot to go to college and get a middle-class job? Because I'm not. I mean, that's a pretty dismal vision, because like, by definition, that's just not going to help most people. Like, the only reason that having a college degree gives you an advantage on the labor market is because most people don't have them, right? Like if everybody had them, then there'd be no advantage, right? You wouldn't get anything out of that. This is the whole thing is, this is like having, rare skills or credentials helps you because other people don't have them. And it's like, well, hold on. I mean, the ability, even if we did somehow achieve total equality of opportunity in that sense, the ability to do well in school or have the like particular cocktail of personality traits and skills and dispositions that like helps you move up some professional class career ladder. I mean, those things aren't evenly distributed in the population. Not everybody is born with as much of those as everybody else, right? You could obviously work on it like you can with any other skill, but like, what you have to work with isn't evenly distributed. So like, if you're not good at school, is it just okay that therefore you have like a much worse life than people who are good at school? And this is not even get into like inherited wealth or anything like that. Like this just seems like a really, like, to me, this seems like an incredibly shallow way to think about equality, but one that's like pretty typical for like mainstream American liberals.
Yeah, there's no question that I think Destiny is like a welfare state liberal or something like that. That's as far as it goes. Like, I think, he might even be at his most left. He's probably like, social democrat, like would like more aspects of like Nordic countries to be implemented in America or something. But I think it depends on case by case basis there. But yeah, I mean, I agree with what you're saying. It's interesting. You made me think about something I often talk about, to my students in the context, here in Canada. I think when I was explaining G.A. Cohen's Why Not Socialism a few weeks ago, and I was talking about the different types of equality of opportunity. And I don't know, we were just talking about different examples, and I always like to use the example of the way that American public schools are funded, because that's so crazy. It's like, it's like such a good example of something where you're just so screwed by geographic circumstances. Because like here, I'm in British Columbia in Vancouver, but like where I'm in Ontario, and I think it's probably the same across Canada, where like public schools, like it's not just purely your like local neighborhood, right? The taxes, and it probably varies by state, right? I'm guessing that maybe some states have more, but that's like a good example, I think, of something that I always like to talk to, because when I explain it to at least Canadian students, they're always shocked. They're like, "What? they're like, the schools are radically different, like depending on the neighborhood. And they're like, I'm like, yeah, in some states.
Yeah, I think in general, I actually don't know of any states in the U.S. where that's not the case, but I'm not, not an expert. I mean, I could be wrong, but I'm not familiar with, with any counterexamples to that. But
yeah, neither am I.
But yeah, I mean, I think, in Cohen's like division and why not socialism, right? I mean, he says, so that's right. Bourgeois equality of opportunity is just you're not. There are no obstacles to your advancement that are like legally set. Like if you're which depending on like which estate you were born into in France before the revolution or something. That if there's no mechanism for a peasant to become a noble. So as long as you don't have that, you have equality of opportunity. But then, the middle level, which I think is roughly where Destiny is what he calls left liberal equality of opportunity, which is like, if we have stuff like school funding depends on, like the tax base in your neighborhood, then that's, that violates that sense of equality of opportunity. But I mean, I think kind of the stuff I was trying to point to earlier is the sort of thing that Cohen has in mind where he says, no, we should really like, at least as our North Star, even if how close social institutions can realistically get to it is going to vary over time. We should have something, what he calls socialist equality of opportunity, so that, you just don't have inequalities that are outside of anybody's control. I mean, right. This is like a couple of years ago, just over 2 years ago, right, when I was on, Joe Rogan, and there's this very funny clip where he asked me if I'm a straight up socialist. Are you like a democratic socialist or like a straight up socialist? And I like tried to explain to him what I believed. I mean, I wasn't going to go into G.A. Cohen and all that and Joe Rogan, but like I sort of tried to gesture at something like that. I was like, look, if there are people who one person has more than another because they just like choose to work more, then okay, I'm not necessarily bothered by that. But but if there's inequality that's outside of their control, then that seems pretty bad. That's Destiny. And then Jordan Peterson, in what we've got just now, has okay, so I've got two superficial comments about this and then one substantive one, and I'm done. So the two superficial comments are, one, as we've been watching, I keep staring at Peterson's jacket and trying to figure out what that like design is. I can't quite tell. I don't know if you guys could tell, but
he always loves those patterns.
And like in suit jackets, that just feels very Riddler-ish to me. But
he's trying to become a super villain.
The other superficial comment is that beyond weird word choice, he keeps saying the word gigantism in a weird way. Like I can't even remember it exactly now as I'm trying to think, but he's definitely saying it oddly, right? Like the pronunciation is very odd. But putting that aside, right, the gigantism concern, I think Ethan was saying some of this earlier, but it's like, is that really what people are objecting to? Right? Is the gigantism? I mean, like, look, this is not a stunningly original point, but like, I don't know. I mean, if conservatives typically want to impose more government regulation on like what happens in a womb, right? That seems like a pretty big government, right? And I'm also like, I'm even less convinced by the idea that the sort of main thing that the left, at least if he's using the word the left in a way I recognize, is concerned with is like corporate gigantism. Is that really the issue, that the companies are too big? Right. I mean, it's like there are definitely kinds of corporate power that are made worse by, there being fewer corporations and, more monopoly power or whatever. But like, it seems like if we're talking about the left, that's not really the issue. I mean, like, if anything, like it seems like, there's a lot of like some of the things the left dislikes the most about private business are actually even worse for smaller ones. That low wages, aggressive union busting, less autonomy, on the job if your boss is like right there with you, all the time. And, you know, even I was thinking about stuff like arguments about the minimum wage, right? That's sort of one of the main conservative arguments against minimum wage hikes is smaller businesses will, you know, end up going out of business because they can't afford it. And, you know, I think we can argue about the extent to which that's true, but like also, you know, to the extent that the concern is about like unemployment, then sure, leftists will take that seriously. But, and, you know, I would argue is a good reason to have like federal jobs programs and stuff, not a good reason to pay people poverty wages. But to the extent that it's just that bigger companies will like gobble up smaller ones because like smaller ones won't be able to afford to pay the higher wages. I mean, I don't know. I think a lot of leftists, at least if we're talking about like people who have positions that are like, well, the left of destiny, would just kind of be like, yeah, okay. Right. Like, I don't, you know, I'm not that bothered by that necessarily, right? Like I don't, and you know, and like certainly in a case like without even getting into like thinking about full socialism or anything, I mean, like even just thinking about basic social democratic stuff, it's like, look, my objection to Blue Cross Blue Shield and Aetna is not that they're too big, right? Like I want a universal Medicare program that would be even bigger.
Yeah, it's just, I mean, it's about the question is the normative value is really just about domination, right? Like size and domination are
about
two
the
different
internal
things,
structure, right? Yeah,
it's like what is what is the structure? What is it doing? Is what matters, not the size, right? So it's just kind of stupid. Anyway, we should continue.
Yeah. We should. Yeah. Since we're already, I should say, by the way, I never said this earlier, but we're not doing a post game tonight because we're just planning in advance for this to be a 2-parter. So
maybe it'll be a 3-parter if we keep having stops like that. Sorry.
Yeah. No, I think that by Canadian standards, that was like a real chiding. Like like he didn't raise his voice or anything, but like that's
just stating hard cold facts here.
Fair enough. Let's keep going.
Those two. First of all, it's a paradox to me that the conservatives and the leftists face off each other with regard to their concern about different forms of gigantism and don't seem to notice that the thing that unites them is some antipathy. This is especially true for the libertarians, some antipathy towards gigantic structures per se. And so then I would say, with regards to your antithesis between liberalism and conservatives, the conservatives are pointing to the fact that there are intermediary forms of distribution that can be utilized to solve the social problems that you're describing that don't bring with them the associated problem of gigantism. And like it's been shocking to me to watch the left, especially in the last 6 years, ally itself, for example, with pharmaceutical companies, which was something I'd never thought I would see in my lifetime. I mean, for decades, the only gigantic corporations the left was more skeptical of than the fossil fuel companies were the pharmaceutical companies. And that all seemed to vanish overnight around the COVID time. So I know the story. That's a lot of things to throw at you, but it sort of outlines the territory that we could probably investigate productively.
Yeah, so a couple things. I would say that the current political landscape we have, I think, is less. I understand the concept of conservatives supporting corporations and liberals supporting like large government. I think today the divide we're starting to see more and more is more of like a populist, anti-populist rise, or even like an institutional or anti-institutional rise. So, for instance, I think conservatives today in the United States are largely characterized with, I would say, with populism. In that they're supporting like certain figures, namely right now Donald Trump, who they think alone can kind of like lead them against the corrupt institutions, be them corporate or government. I feel like most conservatives today are not as trustful of big corporations as they were back in like the Bush era, where we would, conservatives would champion, big corporations.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
That's a strange thing because it makes the modern conservatives a lot more like the 60s leftists.
Potentially, yeah.
I mean, that brings us into the issue, too, of whether the left-right divide is actually a reasonable way of construing the current political landscape at all. And I'm not sure it is, but
Right now, it kind of is, but only because so many conservatives are following Trump. So like your populist, anti-populist thing kind of maps on kind of cleanly to the left and right. It doesn't work with progressives, though, or the far left, because they're also anti-large everything. So in a surprising way, on very, very far left people, you might find them having a bit more in common with kind of like a MAGA Trump supporter than like a center-left liberal. So for instance, like both of these groups of people on the very far left will be very dovish on foreign policy, probably a little bit more isolationist. They're not a big fan of like a ton of immigration or a ton of trade with other countries. They might think that there's a lot of institutional capture of both government and corporations. So both all of the MAGA supporters and the far, far left might think that corporations don't have our best interest at heart and the government is corrupt and captured by lobbyists. You'll see a lot of overlap there.
Right.
I think that sometimes there's a couple things. One is just something I feel like I've discovered. People have no principles. I think that people are largely guided by whatever is kind of satisfying them or making them feel good at the time. I think that's a really important thing to understand because people's beliefs will seem to change at random. If you're trying to imagine that a belief is coming from some underlying principle or is governed by some internal, like moral or reasonable code or whatever. I think generally there are large social groups and people kind of follow them along from thing to thing, which is why you end up in strange worlds sometimes where, like the position on vaccines and being an anti-vaxxer might have been seen as something, 10 years ago as kind of like a hippie leftist. And now maybe it's more like a conservative or it's associated more with like MAGA Trump supporters or whatever. I think as a result of how the social groups move around. When it comes to you mentioned this like gigantism thing. That's another thing where I'm not sure if people actually care about gigantism or if they're using it as a proxy for other things that they don't like. Like I could totally imagine.
Well, I care about it.
Sure. Yeah, you might. Yeah, sorry. It just meant in general.
That's okay.
Because like I could imagine somebody saying that like they don't trust like a large government, they think there's too much prone to tyranny or something like that, but also be supportive of an institution like the Catholic Church, which is literally one guy who is a direct line to God.
They can't tax.
Well, I mean, and
they don't have a military. They can't conscript you.
True.
Right?
Yeah.
And they can't throw you in jail.
That is true. Yeah. I mean,
well, those are major and significant. I mean, I get the overlap. Don't get me wrong.
Sure. But I'm saying like, even if you had a local government, like if you had a state government or a tribe, usually they've got some form of enacting punishment. It'll be sometimes more brutal, but they can throw you in jail. Conscription hasn't existed in the US since the Vietnam War. I mean, yeah, true. Yes.
Yeah, true.
So yeah, I think that I guess when I look at
let's go back. Well, let's go back to the redistribution issue. I mean, we pay 65% of our income at, say, upper middle class to upper middle class level in Canada. It isn't obvious to me at all that money is well used. In fact, quite the contrary. In my country now, our citizens make 60% they produce 60% of what you produce in the US. That's plummeted over the last 20 years as state intervention has increased. I'm not convinced that the claim that the interests of people who lack opportunity are best served by state intervention. And there's a couple of reasons for that. I mean, first of all, I'm aware of the relationship between inequality and social problem. There's a very well-developed literature on that, and it essentially shows that the more arbitrary, the broader the reach of inequality in a political institution of any given size, the more social unrest. So where all people are poor, there isn't much social unrest, and where all people are rich, there isn't much social unrest. But when there's a big gap between the two, there's plenty, and that's mostly driven by disaffected young men who aren't very happy that they can't climb the hierarchy. There are barriers in their way. And so there is reason to ameliorate relative poverty. The problem with that, to some degree, is that most attempts to ameliorate relative poverty tend to increase absolute poverty, and they do it dramatically. And the only solution that we've ever been able to develop to that is something approximating a free market system. I wouldn't call it a capitalist system because I think that's capture of the terminology by the radical leftists. It's a free exchange system. And the price you pay for a free exchange system is you still have inequality, but the advantage you gain is that the absolute levels of privation plummet. And I think the data on that I think they're absolutely conclusive, and that's been especially demonstrated in the radical decrease in rates of poverty since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989. because we've lifted more people out of poverty in the last 4 decades than we had in the entire course of human history up to that date. And that's not least because the statist interventionist types who argued for a radical state-sponsored redistribution lost the Cold War, right? And that freed up Africa to some degree, and certainly the Southeast Asian countries, to pursue something like a free trade economy. And that instantly made them rich, even China. So that's an argument, let's say, on the side of free exchange, but it's also an argument, a twofold argument, pointing out how we ameliorate absolute poverty, which should be a concern for leftists, but doesn't seem to be anymore, by the way, and also an argument for the maintenance of a necessary inequality. Like, I'm not sure that inequality can be decreased beyond a certain degree without that decrease causing other serious problems. And we can talk about that, but it's a complicated problem.
Yeah, for one point of clarification, when you say leftist, what do you mean by that?
Well, I was going with your definition, like essentially that the core idea being something like the central problem being one of relative inequality and distribution of resources, and the central solution to that being something like state-sponsored economic intervention. I mean, there's other ways we could define left and right, and we can do that, but I'll stick with the one that you brought forward to begin with.
Gotcha. Okay. I only want to be clear on that because people get mad if I call myself a leftist. Oftentimes online or especially in Europe or worldwide, leftists will refer exclusively to like socialists or communists, and anybody to the right of that would be considered like a liberal. If you
no, usually a fascist.
Well, depending on
very rapidly.
Yeah. I just wanted to be clear on that. So I'm absolutely a pro-capitalist, pro-free market guy. I'm never gonna.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's good. It's good to get that clear. Why?
Yeah. Because I would argue that when you look at like the fall of the Soviet Union, or you look at the failure of like socialist or communist regimes, I don't know if the issue there was so much redistribution. I think the problem,
that was one of many issues.
I don't think it was an issue at all, actually, I would say. I think the issue was command economies.
Wait a minute.
Yeah.
Wait a minute. What do you mean redistribution wasn't an issue? What the hell do you think they did to the kulaks? That was forced redistribution. It resulted in the death of 6 million people. So maybe I'm not understanding what you mean, but that was redistribution at its like pinnacle.
Sure.
And forced redistribution. And it was brutal.
When I think of the strengths of capitalism, the ability for markets to dynamically respond to shifting consumer demand is like the reason why capitalism and free market economies dominate the world. When you've got socialist or communist systems, command economies where a government is trying to say, this is how much this is going to cost, this is how much you're going to produce and make. This is a failed way of managing a state economy. Even in places where they still do it, there are always shadow economies and stuff. There were in the Soviet Union that prop up where people try to basically ameliorate the conditions that are resulting from said horrible command economy practices. So I guess in a way you could argue a command economy is kind of like redistribution. It's a form of it, but
no, it's a worse problem. If you're pointing to the fact that that's a worse problem, I'm
I would say that's definitely the reason why these places failed, because they just weren't able to respond to changing conditions.
Okay, so what's the difference between
going online without ExpressVPN?
I guess we're forced to stop here, Ben.
Yeah, it's as good a time as any to pause, because we're going to have to skip past this, or I guess just watch the ExpressVPN.
No, we're definitely not going to watch the ExpressVPN.
But yeah, this is so it is interesting when at the beginning of that, I wanted to go like a good 10 minutes, just because I'm trying to get through a certain amount of this tonight. But near the beginning of that, there was this interesting thing where Destiny was saying that there's like a lot of overlap between like the far left and the Trumpists. I was like, all right, this will be interesting, right? Where's he going to go with this? And he said some things that were just kind of wacky. Like he brought up like immigration, which is a place where it's like, even in the way that Destiny is likely to use the word far left, like, what are you talking about, right? Like there's no But he did say, and I guess I can understand this from his perspective, that there's overlap on like having a more dovish, less interventionist foreign policy. And like I get why he thinks that, because like he's probably used to having like both like leftist and Trumpy people like yell at him for some of his hawkish positions. But also, I mean, man, it really hurts to see that, because this is just conceding something that like should not be conceded, which is that like there actually is this like kind of MAGA, like real serious anti-interventionism. I mean, this is the stuff that in Kyle Kalinski's debate with Jordan Peterson, I think he rightly pressed him on it, right? That's like, wait a second, what are you talking about, right? Like Trump assassinated Soleimani and, brought us to the brink of war with Iran. He doubled the rate of drone strikes in Yemen. He did everything that Netanyahu asked him to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's like this wasn't actually dovish at all. I mean, the kind of thing that people bring up is like, oh, Trump didn't start any like new wars. Like, well, he sure continued a lot that were already ongoing, and he came very close to starting some new ones, and he certainly intensified like various things the empire was doing around the world. It's like, if you're just getting gold star for like going one term without starting a full-fledged new war, that's like Obama didn't in his second term either.
Yeah, I think it's also worth mentioning that like when we're comparing, like, I think there is a segment of, certainly not the Trumpists, but there is some section of the like far right that is a bit more like isolationist. But like even that, I think, is like sort of fundamentally different in character compared to what you see like on the left. Whereas like people on the right seem to have this sort of like prescription that we need to completely isolate ourselves from other countries. Not only should we not like go to war with them and intervene in their affairs, but we shouldn't take in refugees, we shouldn't take in immigrants, we shouldn't trade with them, blah blah blah. And this is all born out of this sort of position that like we should only care for our own people, and people outside of this country just matter less. Whereas like I take it that the more common like left view is like a sort of less like an internationalism and more like, less like an isolationism and more like a sort of internationalism, where it's like we don't want to go to war with other countries precisely because we do care about people in other countries and we don't want to kill them, but we're fine to take in refugees and like immigrants and like trade back and forth, etc., and even engage on some level in foreign policy, so long as it's like multilateral and cooperative and democratic, rather than this sort of like unilateralist intervention that like the US is constantly engaging in. So I think it's a sort of very like superficial comparison.
Yeah, I mean, I think this came out really strongly when Henry Kissinger died, because I saw a lot of right wingers who are sort of very branded as like very like very like anti-neocon kind of right wingers, either outright celebrating Kissinger or at least being like, well, he wasn't all bad, and basing that on and being like, well, this is good because he wasn't like these like crazy neocons who have all this moral fervor about how they think foreign policy should work. He had this like realist view of foreign policy that wasn't that wasn't like morally fanatical. And it's like a lot of this stuff I'm thinking here of like the article that was published about Kissinger in Compact after he died, or like on Breaking Points there was Crystal and Sagar had a back and forth about this, where Sagar was basically taking this line, or like there's a guy on actually when I went on News Nation to talk about Kissinger, the guy they had argue with me was like from the American Conservative, was definitely taking this line. And it's like one of the places where it's like this really comes out, like exactly what you're saying comes out the most, right? Is it that like, oh, the problem with the neocons is that they care too much about people in other countries, right? Or is it that no, if you care about people in other countries, you don't want to turn their countries into war zones because that's a horrible thing for people?
Yeah. There's also unless anybody has anything else to say on the sort of foreign policy comparison point, I also thought some of Jordan Peterson's comments, like he complains, it seems weird that leftists don't understand, like they think the government's needed to address like inequality and poverty and all that, but they just don't understand that there's like these intermediary solutions like charity. I mean, it's like number one, like, this is one case, like I try not to like go too much into empirics when I'm talking about stuff, because I just don't have like the background to be like super involved in empirics. But like this is really one of those cases where the empirics are just like overwhelmingly clear that like poverty is very effective, or sorry, welfare is very effective at decreasing poverty, and charity just is not at all. Because like, and I mean, it's like, relatively intuitive as well. Like, how many people do you know who like donate an amount to charity that's comparable to like what they'd be taxed in like a Nordic country, like regularly? And it's also like, there's also a sort of fundamental moral point, which is like, even if charity did work or could work in alleviating poverty, like, do we really want, like, take all the people who can't work and who need some sort of support, like disabled people, unemployed people, etc. Like, do we really want these people's like basic necessities to sort of depend on the generosity of others, even if other people do happen to be generous enough? Or do we want their sort of basic necessities to just be like guaranteed as a matter of law, and sort of not in the same way contingent on whether other people in the society are willing to give it to them?
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, this is like, even when there is just as much, I take it this is your point, right? Even when there is, like, even if there was just as much money being spent by private charities as would be spent by a welfare state, which like there never is and never would be. But like, even if there was, people's relationship to charity is fundamentally different than their relationship to like a universal social program. That if you're in like anytime you're like going like hat in hand to like other private citizens, right, that it's like up to them, right? You're convincing them that that you really deserve it, right? That it's like, and if so, whether it's like what you really deserve it might mean for like a Christian charity or whatever, if it's like effective altruism, whether you're it's like one of the requirements is that it has to be like underserved, that they that's like there can't be enough charity already directed at it, so the algorithm's constantly changing, right, about whether you still you're still at the top of the pile, for who needs help, right? And yeah, you just don't have, I mean, there's some obvious like freedom from domination concerns there that about being dependent on the goodwill of other private actors about whether you get this help or not. So I think that's absolutely true. It's also just crazy when he's saying, like, I mean, he's going from, like, I actually think Destiny to call balls and strikes here wasn't awful in the last thing he said, because I think that what he was saying about fully planned economies, he is actually putting his finger on like a real thing, right? The calculation problem about setting prices and coordinating production with fine-grained consumer preferences and all that stuff. Like, those were all like very real problems. I don't think that like those entail that, I guess we just have to live, like capitalism must be therefore be the best we can do for all time, right? Like, that's a large, much bigger discussion. But those are at least like real problems, and fair enough, right? But Jordan Peterson, I think, the only way I can make sense of the empirical claims he was making there is that that's kind of what he has in mind, but he's just sort of overgeneralizing that to like any sort of redistribution of wealth, because otherwise I literally don't know what the fuck he's talking about. He's saying all this, it's like, what, there's like any like attempt by government at ameliorating relative inequality is going to lead to more absolute poverty. That's not true. Like, you think there's more absolute poverty in Sweden than there is in the United States? Like,
it's
silly.
He's definitely got a very low resolution understanding of political concepts, right? Of what, like, or even giving a causal explanation of like how politics happens or how economic policies happen, and just kind of, he seems captured by certain kinds of buzzwords or buzz ideas, and it's like, oh, redistribution bad. It's like, that's the cause of it, and you can kind of see it. I mean, he just very much is giving me like angry boomer uncle at Thanksgiving complaining about redistribution here, and like not really knowing what he's talking about. But we should continue, I think.
No, we should. Skelumph says also it is not just true about Kissinger's very willing to support neocons, which God, yes, that is true. In fact, you know, it is really worth, like, when people talk about this stuff, it's like, it is really amazing that's like people like forget. It's like, look, you know, Henry Kissinger was an advisor to George W. Bush. He supported the Iraq War, right? Like, so yeah, that's just very, very strange. Only two things I want to say real quick before we resume, just while I'm thinking about them, are one, I saw somebody in the chat say like, oh yeah, because Peterson was saying, oh, I guess you need to do a little bit about relative inequality because then the young men with status anxieties are, you know, going to act out. And somebody in the chat was like, oh yeah, the young women don't mind, right? You know,
whether you can participate in like the basic activities of your society is like not a concern for women.
Yeah, exactly. That, and it's like, I don't know, man. I would suggest like reading a little bit about, you know, Parisian women in the French Revolution. The idea that that they're, you know, that they're going to be copacetic with economic inequality is pretty dubious. And on that subject, by the way, all this stuff like, and you know, again, credit where credit's due. Destiny did have the right response on gigantism eventually, which was like, yeah, it's about the, like, it does, you know, because like, yeah, because Peterson was like, oh, the church can't tax. And it's like, well, I mean, it can't anymore, right?
It
like,
did. Right. And the church had an army at one point as well.
Totally, yeah. Like the church no longer can tax or has an army, but that's the, you know, that's a result of like past historical battles that conservatives lost, right? Like this is like a lot of what, again, go back to the French Revolution, a lot of what people are fighting about was whether in fact the church should have, you know, this kind of status in society. But then, yeah, Destiny's response, which was like eventually correct, was like, yeah, look, you can have like a very small tribe and they still have the ability to kill you, right? It's not really about the size, right? I mean, like if what you're objecting to is coercive power, right? That's not really about, you know, size per se. But yeah, we should keep going.
Yeah.
Okay, so what's the difference between a state that attempts to redistribute to foster equality of opportunity and a command economy? Is it a difference of degree? Like, are you looking at models, let's say like the Scandinavian countries? Or I wouldn't use Canada, by the way, because Canada is now what would you call predicted by economic analysts to have the worst performing economy for the next 4 decades of all the developed world. So maybe we'll just leave the example of Canada off the table. Sure. Scandinavian countries are often the polities that are pointed to by, I would say, by people who, at least in part, are putting forward a view of redistribution for purposes of equality of opportunity like you are. But they're a strange analogy because they're very small countries, and up till now they were very ethnically homogenous. Exactly, and that makes a big difference when you're trying to flatten out the redistribution. Plus, they're also incredibly wealthy, which makes, you know, redistribution, let's say, a lot easier. So why doesn't a government that's bent on redistribution fall prey to the pitfalls of command economy and forced redistribution, for that matter? How do you protect against that?
I think what you have to do is very, very, very difficult. Is people get very ideologically captured by both ends, and they feel very, I guess, like committed, or they feel very allegiant to pushing certain forms of economic organization. And I think sometimes it blinds them to some of the benefits of what exists when you incorporate kind of multiple models, or I mean, you'd call them mixed economies, which is really what every capitalist economy today is. It's some form of free market capitalism combined with some form of like government intervention to control for negative externalities. These are the ways that all economies, even in Scandinavia and the world, work. And I think that recognizing the benefits of both systems are the best way to make things work. Yeah.
Fair enough. And the Scandinavian countries seem to have done a pretty good job of that. But like I said, they have a simpler problem to solve, let's say, than the Americans have. Negative externalities. That's an interesting rabbit hole to wander down, because the problem I have with negative externalities, you made a case already that, and again, correct me if I've got this wrong, but I think that I understood what you said. A free market, free exchange economy is a gigantic distributed computational device.
Basically, yeah.
Right, exactly. And
Which,
so,
funnily enough, one of the big problems for command economies is called the computation problem, because no central body can actually compute,
yes,
the ins and outs of.
right, exactly. Right. That's not, that's a fatal problem, right? Because it doesn't have the computational power. It certainly doesn't have the speed of data recognition. It doesn't have the on-the-ground agents if all of the perception and decision-making is centralized, right? It's way too low resolution. It's going to crash. Okay, so, and I think that's comprehensible technically as well as ideologically. All right, so, but having said that, with regards to externalities, all the externalities that a market economy can't compute are so complex that they can't be determined centrally by the same argument. And
there are ways to account for them, though.
Really?
That work with.
Tell me.
Yeah.
How.
So
because I can't see that, because I can't see how that they can be accounted for without the same computational problem immediately arising.
Yeah, and I understand that. And I think that's a problem sometimes of people very far on the left when they want to deal with certain problems. I think that they want to bring like heavy-handed, like things like price controls in to say, well, we need less of this, so let's just make this cost this particular thing, which ironically enough introduces a whole other set of externalities that will happen when you get a lot of friction between where your price floor or ceiling is set compared to what a market was set at. But ideally, if you're a reasonable person and you view economies as mixed economies, what you try to do is you try to take these externalities, meaning things that aren't accounted for with your primary system. So in a capitalist system, an externality might be something that causes a negative effect, but it doesn't cost you any money. Pollution would be a good example of that. And rather than saying like, well, no company can pollute this much, or, if you're a company, you have to use these things because the other things are making too much pollution, all you do is you say, okay, well, if we've determined that, say, carbon is bad for the atmosphere, well, we're just going to attach a little price to that.
Okay,
government is going to say that, yeah, if you pollute this much, here's the price. And then if you want to pay for it, you can. But that type of intervention in the economy basically allows the free market to hopefully do its job, because the government has tacked on a little bit of a price something that tries to account for the cost of that externality. Yeah.
Great. That's a great example. We can go right down that rabbit hole. Carbon. Okay. So first of all, one of the things I've seen, you tell me what you think about this, something that I've seen that actually shocks me, that I was interested in watching over the last 5 or 6 years. I wondered what would happen when the left, the progressives, ran into a conundrum. And the conundrum is quite straightforward. If you pursue carbon pricing and you make energy more expensive, then you hurt the poor. And I don't think you just hurt them. In fact, I know you just don't hurt them. I heard a man 2 days ago who's fed 350 million people in the course of his life, heading the UN's largest relief agency, make the claim quite straightforwardly that misappropriation on the part of interventionist governments increased the rate of absolute privation dramatically in the world over the last 4 or 5 years. And that has happened not least because of carbon pricing, not just carbon pricing, but the insistence that carbon per se is an externality that we should control. Now, Germany's paid a radical price for that, for example. So their power is now about 5 times as expensive as it could be. And they pollute more per unit of power than they did 10 years ago before they introduced these policies that were hypothetically there to account for externality. And the externality was carbon dioxide. I don't think that's a computable externality. And I don't think there's any evidence whatsoever that it's actually an externality that we should be warping the economic system to ameliorate, if the cost of that, and it will be an increase in absolute privation among the world's poor. So, and here's an additional argument on that front with regards to externalities. You get that wrong, and here's something you could get right instead. If you ameliorate absolute poverty among the world's 1 billion poorest, they take a longer view of the future. And that means they become environmentally aware. And so the fastest route to a sustainable planet could well be the remediation of absolute poverty. And the best route to that is cheap energy. And we're interfering with the development of cheap energy by meddling with the hypothetically detrimental externality of carbon dioxide. And so I think this is a complete bloody travesty, by the way. We are putting the lives of hundreds of millions of people directly at risk right now to hypothetically save people in the future, depending on the accuracy of our projections 100 years out. And these interventionists, these people who are remediating externalities, they actually believe that they can calculate an economic projection 1 century out. That's utterly delusional.
So, okay, so just to be clear, the first thing, I was just giving an example of how you can use like a government intervention to make a free market track something, which is what cap and trade or like carbon taxes would do. I wasn't necessarily speaking to the strength of that individual thing, but
that's a good thing to focus on.
Yeah, we can focus on that as well.
Externality.
We can focus on that as well. So the first thing, this is going to sound mean, but I'm very realistic. There needs to be a better argument than just it disproportionately impacts the poor. That's not always
classic leftist argument.
Sure, it might be, but
but it's the same argument you made to justify your swing to the left at the beginning of our discussion. You said that you were looking at economic inequalities that disproportionately affected the poor. So I can't see why, and I'm not trying to be mean about this either. I can't see why you could base your argument that it was morally appropriate for you to swing to the left from your previous position because you saw disproportionate effects on the poor. And I can't use that argument in the situation that I'm presenting it right now.
Well, because it depends on if we think it's a condition that ought to be remedied or not. For instance, if I walk, around and I see homeless people and I'm like, man, this is really sad. We ought to spend more money on homeless people because it seems like they're disproportionately affected by their living conditions. And then somebody says, oh, well, do you think we should still lock up, rapists and murderers? Aren't they disproportionately poor? I'd probably say, well, yeah, we probably should. And I go, well, isn't that hypocritical? Well, no, I think that rapists and murderers should probably be in jail, but we can also help the homeless at the same time. I think that just helping the poor isn't an argument like a blank check to do every possible thing to satisfy poorer people.
Right.
It's going to depend on from issue to issue.
That's fine.
So like, for instance, I think
because the poor, everyone who's poor is not a victim. Some people who are poor are psychopathic perpetrators.
Sure.
And it's very useful to distinguish them. But I was making a much more specific argument. My argument was that the fastest way out of absolute privation for the world's bottom billion people is through cheap energy.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying there. So I just working my way towards that. I just want to say that just because something targets the poor is not necessarily an argument against it.
Depends on how hard it targets them, and it depends on whether mass starvation is the outcome.
The outcome is important. That I agree with. So, for instance, like a sin tax.
The outcome will be mass starvation.
I'm getting to it. Okay. Yeah, I'm getting to it. Okay. Sin taxes on like cigarettes and alcohol are always going to disproportionately impact the poor, or even sugar, we might say, right? But just because that disproportionately impacts the poor, is that a good thing or a bad thing? These are probably the people that suffer the most from those particular afflictions.
Right.
So,
and that is an immediate versus delayed issue too, right? Because the reason,
obesity is an immediate. I don't think alcoholism.
The reason for the tax is to stop people from pursuing a certain form of short-term gratification at the cost of their longer-term well-being.
Correct, and that exact same idea. If you believe climate models, or if you believe that we're heading in a certain direction in terms of climate, the overall warming of the planet, would be the same argument you would make for climate change.
Only if you believe that you could model economic development 100 years into the future.
Well, we're not trying to model. We're more concerned with modeling climate development, economic development.
We're equally. Tell me how I'm wrong. I don't believe that, because what I see happening is two things. We have climate models that purport to explain what's going to happen over a century on the climate side, but we have economic models layered right on top of those that claim that there's going to be various forms of disaster for human beings economically as a consequence of that climate change. And so that's like two towers of Babel stacked on top of one another. And so, because if people were just saying, oh, the climate's going to change, there'd be no moral impetus in that. It's the climate's going to change and that's going to be disastrous for the biosphere and for humanity. But that's an economic argument as well as a climate-based argument.
It's both, but the worst projections of what would happen if the climate took a disastrous turn are worse than the worst projections of what is our planet going to look like economically if we hardcore police.
Right. But why would you? Okay, but I don't understand the distinction between the models.
Well, the argument would be that whatever pain and suffering poor people might endure right now because of a move towards green energy, that pain and suffering is going to be short-term and far less than the long-term pain and suffering.
Right, but that's dependent on the integrity of the economic models and
the climate models as well, right?
Exactly, but is in exactly the stacked manner that I described. And like, there's nobody in 1890 who could have predicted what was going to happen in 1990 economically. Not a bit. And if we think we can predict like 50 years out now with the current rate of technology and calculate the potential impact of climate change on economic flourishing for human beings, we're deluded. No one can do that. And then, it's worse. So imagine that as you do that and you project outward, your margin of error increases. That's absolutely, definitely the case. And at some point, you're certainly on the climate side, the margin of error gets rapidly to the point where it subsumes any estimate of the degree to which the climate is going to transform. And that happens even more rapidly on the economic side.
Potentially,
so,
but right now, I think right now, this is a disagreement on the fact of the matter, though, not the philosophy of what we're talking about in terms of controlling externalities. If we think, I'm curious, let's say that we think we can accurately predict the climate and the economic impact, and we think that the climate impact would be far worse if we don't account for that, both in terms of human conditions.
I don't believe any of those presumptions.
Sure, but then if you don't, but I mean, like, obviously, if I agree.
Gotta say, one of the things that most triggers me that people say in arguments is when you lay out a hypothetical to try to test what principles they're working from, and they say, well, I just don't think that that's true. It's like, yeah, I didn't say you did, right? Like I'm saying, like, I want to understand your position. So like, if X, Y, and Z were true, right, then would you agree with this or not? Right. Like it's, I mean, this shit drives me crazy. Like, I think this is like a really basic, like, this is kind of the, like, you must be this tall to ride the rides of like having this kind of discussion that like, can you entertain a hypothetical example and then like see what would follow from it. Right. Even if like, yes, I definitely don't think that's true. That's nice. Right. Like, that's not what I'm asking you right now.
Very few people, it seems, are capable of doing well. Yeah. I mean, very few, very notable, like conservatives seem capable of engaging in this hypothetical. It's like a common tactic. I even noticed it. Don't ask me why. I think I was just really interested. I was listening to the oral arguments for the Supreme Court case that's happening right now about like the abortion pill.
Mm-hmm.
The mifepristone or whatever it's called.
Yep.
And it was just funny how like the conservative side, like the lawyers were being asked about like, because like their main issue is that the doctors are being injured by the potential scenario that they might have to like treat a woman who's having a bad side effect from the drug, and therefore like have a hand in assisting in an abortion because they have to help this woman. Okay.
Awesome.
And like, and then one of the conservative or one of the liberal judges, I think Ketanji Brown Jackson, was like, well, okay, but like, what if, okay, but are you telling me that if we could guarantee you that there was a remedy, that there were systems in place where like, if that situation came up, there were like systems in place where another doctor could step in really quickly. Like, would that be enough of a remedy for you? And she was like, well, I just don't think that that's practical. Right. And it's like exactly that scenario, just like unwilling to engage. I know that's like a weird example to bring up, but like, just like this inability to engage with a hypothetical, or like unwillingness to engage in a hypothetical to get to like the core of like, well, what's your real reasoning here?
Totally.
Beyond, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, look, I have, right. Exactly. Like, and yeah, that would be a really good way to test what the claim is. Or like I had, I wrote an article that made a lot of people mad a few weeks ago for Jacobin. That sentence is true about once every 6 months. This is about, Israel, Palestine. And like, I've written a lot of things about that made a lot of people mad, but usually they're Zionists. Like this is the only one that like has made people who basically agree with me mad. Because I was, arguing essentially that, it's that claims about who counts as like the original inhabitants or whatever, completely irrelevant normatively. And that like everything you want to say about this is like, you don't need that. Right. And so some of the people who got mad at the article were like, oh, what about the right of return? And, don't you need it for that? And, because my argument is like, well, just universalism, everybody should have equal rights. And I kept posing this question. I think literally to dozens of people over the course of the weeks of people being mad about this article. Is like, okay, well, look, pretend that we were in a timeline where the first Palestinian families showed up, like, let's say a year after, right? The first Zionist settlers in the 1870s. But then like everything from the 1870s and now happened in exactly the same way, right? Would the Nakba be okay? Would the subsequent denial of the right of return be okay? Right. Like, and nobody, it's like I just keep getting, it's like, oh well, that's not what happened. It's like, yeah, it's not, right? But like I'm trying to test what you think about the principle, right? Like, and you're just not doing it, right? So okay, so that's that rant about methodology. More substantively, it seems like this whole discussion, I would say, I mean, obviously, in a sense, I'm much more sympathetic to what Destiny is saying here, in the sense that A, he acknowledges that climate change is real, and B, and he doesn't, like Jordan Peterson's got his whole deeply asinine thing he's been doing forever about how like you can't like, because models are uncertain or whatever, we should just throw up our hands and just like pretend that we have no idea, what's going to happen, or like what the dangers are of the climate emergency. But like, so, okay, he's not doing that. And then B, I so frustrated when people do this, like, oh, I'm not going to entertain hypotheticals thing, that like both of those very much incline me to Destiny's side of this, like part of the conversation, but also is, I also kind of think this is like really like a demonstration of what's most frustrated about seeing like mainstream liberals argue with conservatives about this stuff. Because they're both like, notice what they have in common here, which is the assumption that, yes, of course, we're going to have to fix climate change, like on the backs of poor people.
Yeah.
It's like the whole idea of like the Green New Deal and all that stuff was like, you don't have to do that, right? That in other words, it's like, yeah, I mean, if you're, if you just take it for granted that like whatever you do about climate change is going to have to like be bad for the material interests of poor working class people, it's like, man, that gives the Jordan Petersons of the world a lot of ammunition that, you don't like, I mean, I can still understand if you did think that, why you might still think it was worth it, in the long term. But like, but it's like, why should you assume that, right? I mean, it's like, this is like, I mean, if anything, yeah, we could have like massive job programs for the energy transition, that's, you could massively build out public transportation, make people less, less reliant on individual cars, right? It's like that, I mean, look, I could I could respect somebody being like, no, Ben, you're being too optimistic, like ultimately, there's going to be places where the rubber meets the road and these things be in conflict. I mean, that's like an argument we can have, right? Like I can understand that, but like just the degree to which everybody's taking it for granted in this conversation, that's like, of course you have to pick between those things, is really frustrating to me.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I don't know. I wonder whether if you push Destiny enough, he would like admit that. Like, I don't know. It's not clear to me how committed he is, because like I feel like what I'm seeing in this conversation, and maybe I'm being too charitable to Destiny, is like Jordan Peterson being kind of deranged about like privation and like, and then just like, and I feel like Destiny's trying to just be like, okay, like I'll accept what you're saying here, but like, what about this? What about this? Like, I feel like you might be right, but I feel like we haven't really gotten to a point where I feel like I could say for sure that Destiny would say like, oh yeah, like this is the case. I feel like he's just kind of like, okay, Jordy, I'll go with you here, right? But like, I'll go with you. I'll go down this road with you. But like, what about this? What about this? And I feel like, so it feels maybe like it could be, or it's just as likely, because that it could be related to like a tactic to just be like, I'll take that for granted. Let's keep down this line of debate.
Yeah, that might be right.
I also wanted to add, because like one of the first things that was said when we pressed play was like this move that a lot of, it's sort of like the standard conservative move when you bring up the Nordic countries, and it's always always very annoying.
Oh yeah,
where he's like, oh yeah, but the Nordic countries are they're smaller and they're more homogenous, so let's like throw them out. I mean, well, one thing is like, people who say this like never specify like the mechanism through which these things are supposed to like make it more difficult. It's just like there are differences between the countries, and I think that's sufficient to just say we can't learn anything from them. Like maybe they're colder and whatever, so
they're white, or it's all white
exactly people. But it's like, particularly with the size thing, it's weird because like the fact that the Nordic countries are smaller countries actually makes it harder for them to do what they do. Mainly because like smaller countries are more reliant on the global economy. Right. So like small countries like the Nordics have to like export more because of their smaller domestic market. So they can only grow their businesses if they, sell on a global market. And then like if their exports become uncompetitive because of their high taxes and like labor costs due to unions and stuff, that's like a much bigger problem for the Nordics than it is for a bigger country like the US, because the US depends less on exports for its GDP. And then also like
That's a really good point.
the fact that the Nordics are smaller also means that it's easier for people who are investing in the global economy to like, if the Nordics, like if the economic environment in the Nordics becomes too unfavorable, companies would be more able to just sort of skip over them and say, okay, I'm just not going to invest in any companies in the Nordic countries because they wouldn't be missing much because the economies are smaller. But like, it'd be much harder to skip over the US in terms of investing in companies because the US is much bigger, even if, investors started disliking the business climate more. So it's like, so people bringing up like the Nordics are smaller. It's like, well, yeah, that should make us more optimistic about our ability to replicate their success. And then like the homogeneity thing is also weird because it's like, it feels like it only obviously works as a political argument. Like, yeah, the fact that there's lots of diversity and people are racist or whatever might make it harder to do a welfare state. But that's not a reason to think that it's less desirable to do the kinds of things that the Nordic did. It just, might be more difficult, like politically. But it's like not at all clear how the homogeneity is supposed to, like, getting more money makes you less poor regardless of your skin color.
Right.
Yeah, it doesn't really make sense. That also really irritated me, that whole thing about like, sorry, Ben, but like, that whole, that always irritates me, that point about, and those are really good points, Ethan. I also wonder, like, I always ask myself too, like, why, like, okay, so it just means you have to, like, what are these welfare programs anyway? It just means if you have more people, you're going to have a bigger pot of money. Is it just that the bureaucracy is going to be more complicated? I mean, I guess that's potentially a reason, but I don't know. Anyway,
but it doesn't even seem like that's really going to be true, right? That the bureaucracy is more complicated, because it just seems like, but you'll have more bureaucrats if you're having the same number of bureaucrats per recipient, but like it's not really more structurally complicated. Like this is, this stuff always, like, I really like Ethan's point about the ways about both of those, right? Because like I think that the thing about the greater dependence on the global economy is plausible, and it's definitely right that it's like, look, any plausibility that the homogeneity has is just like, yes, racism makes it harder to get people to support this stuff. True, but that doesn't mean the stuff itself would work less well, right? Like that's which is the way people always treat that argument. And like ultimately, I like, Victor, I've always had the same frustration with the size argument, because like people just throw it out there as if it were obvious why that meant that, like, that you can't, the successes wouldn't translate, but they never feel the need to spell out the mechanisms. This is like in his book, Responding to the Right. This is what Nathan Robinson calls like it's like the, fjords argument. You might as well say, well, I mean, that wouldn't work here. We don't have fjords. It's like, you pointed to a difference between these two countries, but you haven't explained why it's a relevant difference for like this exact point. And I'm really glad you brought this up, Ethan, because I actually wrote this down when it happened because it annoyed me so much, but then I forgot about it because, of all the climate stuff. Peterson really wants to have it both ways on the Nordics, because earlier, remember, in the previous part we watched, he was saying, oh, well, you can't have, anything you do to do redistribution, that will like maybe decrease relative inequality is going to increase absolute poverty. He was just stating this like with this just like lunatic confidence, like obviously this is true. But then later when he was talking about the Nordics, he was like, yeah, well, it's not that impressive because they're rich. It's like, well, hold on. According to you, why are they rich? Right? Shouldn't this make them not rich according to you? Right? Like, is this your whole point, that they're not going to be rich because you killed the goose that laid the golden egg by doing all the government intervention? And then like in particular, he said there was a frustration, and as with the carbon point, although I do think that like Destiny is has some neoliberalish stuff to some of his politics that makes it the case that like he might really totally genuinely accept the premise that you have to, you know, fix climate change on the backs of the poor. That, you know, like, you know, I mean, this is like, you know, certainly it's what international felt like Macron and all that stuff, right? I mean, it's what they think, right? But like, but you know, as with that, right, where you're right, he might have just been like, you know, yeah, sure, let's accept that. I just want to make a point about what you're saying here. It might not be fair to read that much into this as far as what Destiny thinks, but there's this exchange that really frustrated me because Peterson said something insane and Destiny was like, oh yeah, sure, right? Like I was like, no, challenge him on that, right? Where Peterson's, you know, says, well, they're rich, so you know they, you know, when they like the Nordics are dealing with equality, he says, I wrote this down, they have a much simpler problem than America has. It's like, wait, why? Right? Like, why is that simpler? It's like, I remember when I did the debate with Charlie Kirk, there's a point in there where, you know, he was like, you know, and it's so funny, like, because he seems so proud of himself. You could like see this come in from like a minute away. He was like, you really like Norway, right? It's like, all right. Is this going to be like homogeneity, immigration, or is this going to be oil? Right? Like, it's like, well, you know where they get all that money for the redistribution. They have all this oil. It's like, yeah, okay. You know who else has a lot of oil? The United States of America.
Yeah.
Not to mention, I'm pretty sure Norway is like the only country that has these huge oil reserves. And even like Norway barely uses its oil reserves in terms of like most of it's just like redirected into its sovereign wealth fund. Like very little of Norway's oil money actually goes directly to the welfare state.
That's interesting. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like, God, even if it was all the oil, it's like, well, lucky for us, right? Like you know, you know, we also have a ton of oil, right? Like, So, like, okay, Charlie, you want to nationalize that, and you know, we can use that to fund a welfare state. If you like, it's like, yeah, I don't know. I mean, the United States is an incredibly rich country too. I don't understand this argument at all, right? Like, because again, he just says it with such confidence. Like, wow, they have a much simpler problem. It's like, why? What are the relevant disanalogies that you can actually spell out a mechanism for that make it easier to have an effective welfare state? Like not just politically easier, but like logistically easier to have an effective welfare state in Norway or Sweden or Finland than it would be in the United States. Like I don't, that drives me crazy. Okay. We're almost done, but let's maybe see.
I mean, I could probably do till like 10 after if you want, but
okay. Well, let's at least do, I mean, we would be okay, honestly, probably even if we cut off here, because if you figure,
I mean, we could do a post game for the next one.
Yeah, exactly, right. So if we do a post game for the next one, then I usually assume the breakdown takes twice as long as what we break down. So we've already, I mean, usually I will say more often than not that math actually does tend to be about right. You know, if you look at the past breakdowns, but so right now we've got about an hour and 24 minutes. So if we do a post game next time, then, you know, then we should be able to do it in the 2 hours, the main show plus the hour of the post game. But I'm also not against going for a few more minutes now, at least until they maybe kind of wrap up this and go on.
Yeah, let's do a little bit more. Let's do like at least another 5 or so minutes, and then maybe talk about it for 5 or so minutes. And
sounds like a plan.
Agreed with that factual analysis. I would probably agree with you on the prescription here too, right? And
well,
I don't like none of the climate models were accurate or couldn't accurately predict anything. I'd also say why
they're not sufficiently accurate. That's the first thing. And because they have a margin of error, and it's a large margin of error, they don't even model cloud coverage well. That's a big problem. They don't have the resolution. They don't have nearly the resolution to produce the accuracy that's claimed by the climate apocalypse mongers.
People keep saying that, but we just got another one of the hottest years on record. How many times are we going to have another hottest year on record? How many times are we going to have an increase of carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere before we're finally like, okay.
I don't know. And the reason I don't know is because it depends. The scientific answer to that question depends precisely on the time frame over which you evaluate the climate fluctuation. And that's actually an intractable scientific problem. So you might say, well, if you take the last 100 years, this variation looks pretty dismal. And I'd say, well, what if you took the last 150,000 years, or the last 10,000, or the last 10 million? You can't specify the damn time frame of analysis.
The time frame is incredibly important. That would be like saying, look at your, let's say somebody developed cancer and they didn't realize it, and the person has lost, 40 or 50 pounds in the past 6 months. And I'm just like, you look very sickly. And you're like, okay, well, look at my weight fluctuation over the past 10 years. He's like, well, that doesn't really matter. What matters
I'm not
is the fact
saying
that
the time frame isn't important.
Well, but I'm saying
that it is important.
Yeah,
I'm saying I don't know how to specify it.
Well, you would probably specify it with the beginning of the industrial age, right?
Why?
Because that's when carbon dioxide, which is a gas that's seen as trapping more heat on the planet.
Why is that relevant to the time over which you compute the variability?
Because it seems like as carbon dioxide has increased in the atmosphere, the surface temperatures have risen at a rate that is a departure from what we'd expect over 150,000 year cycles of temperature variations on the planet.
No, not with that time frame. That's
absolutely
just not the case.
It's absolutely the case.
No, what do you mean? You just flipped to 150,000 year time span.
What I'm saying is that if we expect to see a temperature do this in 150,000 year time span, in 100 years time span, seeing it do this, that's very worrying. Now,
you mean like Michael Mann's hockey stick, the one that's under attack right now in court by a major statistician who claimed that he falsified his data? I mean, that spike?
I'm talking about the record temperatures that have been declared for like the past 5 years that have also increased with the concentration of parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. I mean, I'm not going to tell you that every model is perfect.
They're not
right
perfect.
Now, sure, but right now we're like standing in traffic with our eyes closed saying the car hasn't hit me yet, so I don't think there's any coming. I think it's pretty undeniable at this point that there is an impact on climate across the planet. I think
that's highly deniable. We have no idea what the impact is from. We don't know where the carbon dioxide is from. We can't measure the warming of the oceans. We have terrible temperature records going back 100 years. Almost all the terrestrial temperature detection sites were first put outside urban areas, and then then you have to correct. Then you have to correct for the movement of the urban areas, and then you introduce an error parameter that's larger than the purported increase in temperature that you're planning to measure. This isn't data. This is guess. And there's something weird underneath it. There's something weird that isn't oriented well towards human beings underneath it. It has this guise of compassion. Oh, we're going to save the poor in the future. It's like that's what the bloody communists said. And they killed a lot of people doing it. And we're walking down that same road now with this insistence that, we're so compassionate that we care about the poor 100 years from now. And if we have to wipe out several 100 million of them now, well, that's a small price to pay for the future utopia. And we've heard that sort of thing before. And the alternative to that is to stop having global level elites plot out a utopian future or even an anti-dystopian future. And that's exactly what's happening now with organizations like the WEF. And if this wasn't immediately impacting the poor in a devastating manner, I wouldn't care about it that much, but it is. I watched over the course of the last 5 years, the estimates of the number of people who were in serious danger of food privation rise from about 100 million to about 350 million. That's a major price to pay for a little bit of, what would you say, for progress on the climate front that's so narrow it can't even be measured.
I don't think the increase in hungry people on the planet is because of climate policies.
Why not?
Because I don't think that countries in Africa are being pushed away from fossil fuels. I mean, most developing
nations. Of course they are.
Right?
They can't even get loans from the World Bank to pursue fossil fuel development. And there's plenty of African leaders who are screeching at the top of their lungs about that because the elites in the West have decided that, well, it was okay for us to use fossil fuel so that we wouldn't have to starve to death and our children had some opportunities. But maybe the starving masses that are too large a load for the world anyways shouldn't have that opportunity. And that's direct policy from the UN, fostered by organizations like the WEF. They're going to have to turn to renewables. Yeah, well, good luck with that, because renewables have no energy density. Besides that, they're not renewable and they're not environmentally friendly. And then one more thing, there's more weird thing underneath all of this.
Okay.
Well, let's say if carbon dioxide was actually your bugbear and it was genuine. Well, then why wouldn't the Greens, for example, in Africa, the progressives, be agitating to expand the use of nuclear energy? Especially because Germany has to import it anyways, especially because France has demonstrated that it's possible. We could drive down the cost of energy with low-cost nuclear, and there'd be no carbon production. And then the poor people would have something to eat because they'd have enough energy. And that isn't what's happening. And that's one of the things that makes me extremely skeptical of the entire narrative. It's like two things. The left will sacrifice the poor to save the planet. And the left will deindustrialize even at the nuclear level, despite the fact that it devastates the poor. And that's even worse, because if you devastate the poor and you force them into a short-term orientation, in any given country where starvation beckons, for example, they will cut down all the trees and they will kill down all the animals and they will destroy the ecosphere. And so even by the standards of the people who are pushing the carbon dioxide externality control, all the consequences of that doctrine appear to me to be devastating, even by their own measurement principles. We're trying to fix the environment. Well, boys and girls, doesn't look like it's working. All you've managed to do is make energy 5 times as expensive and more polluting. You were wrong. That didn't work. And I can't understand. You can help me. That's why you're here today talking to me. I can't understand how the left can support this.
Just one quick thing. Let's say that everything you've said is true. What do you think is the plan then? What is the goal? What is the drive? Like, why push obviously horrible ideas for the planet and the poor?
That's a good question. That's a good question.
Well, because you're positing it, right? So what do you think is the driver goal?
Well, I listen to what people say. Here's the most terrible thing they say. There are too many people on the planet. Okay, so who says that? I've heard people say that for 30 years. Perfectly ordinary, compassionate people. Well, there's too many people on the planet. And I think, well, for me, that's like hearing Satan himself take possession of their spine and move their mouth. It's like, okay, who are these excess people that you're so concerned about? And exactly who has to go, and when, and why, and how, and who's going to make that decision? And even if you're not consciously aiming at that, you are the one who uttered the words. You're the ones who muttered the phrase. What makes you think that the thing that possessed you to make you utter that words isn't aiming at exactly what you just declared? And so that's a terrible vision. But when you look at what happens in genocidal societies, and they emerge with fair regularity, and usually with a utopian vision at hand, the consequence is the mass destruction of millions of people. So why should I assume that something horrible isn't lurking like that right now, especially given that we have pushed a few 100 million people back into absolute poverty when we were doing a pretty damn good job of getting rid of that? I just don't understand what's happening in Germany or in the UK. Like, it's insane. Like, look, man, if they would have got rid of the nuclear plants and made energy 5 times as expensive, and the consequence would have been they weren't burning lignite coal as a backup, and their unit production of energy, of pollution per unit of energy had plummeted, you could say, well, look, we hurt a lot of poor people, but at least the air is cleaner. It's like, no, air's worse. And everyone's poorer. So, explain to me how the hell the left can be anti-nuclear.
Okay.
I don't understand it at all.
Gotcha. All right. This is something that I brought up earlier that is concerning to me. I feel like when people get political beliefs, I feel like what happens is, what we think happens, what we would hope happen is you have some moral or philosophical underpinning. And then from there, you combine this with some epistemic understanding of the world. And then you combine these two things, you engage in some form of analysis. And your moral view,
nice if that was true.
Yeah, you start to apply like prescriptions. So maybe I'm religious. Maybe I analyze society and I see that particular TV shows lead to premarital sex. So my societal prescription is we should ban these TV shows, right? Ideally, this is how you would imagine this process works. What I find happens, unfortunately, all too often is what people do is they join social groups. And then with those social groups, they inherit something that I call like a constellation of beliefs. And this constellation of beliefs, instead of rationally building on each of these, you basically get this like Jenga tower that is like floating over a table, and every block is like supporting itself, and no real part of the tower can be addressed because you pull out one piece, it all falls apart. So people become like very stuck in all of this combined constellation stuff, and none of it is really given like any analysis, and you can't really push anybody from one way or another in terms of like reevaluating any of the beliefs that are part of this constellation. I wish I would have.
That's good. That's fine. That's right.
You know, I really wasn't sure where to stop because they were
Good place to stop.
kept going on the same subject.
What a deranged boomer uncle, eh? Holy crap! Isn't it? I feel like isn't he at his maximum? Hasn't he reached peak boomer grumpy uncle?
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
it's like he's fully transformed into like the archetypical boomer uncle. He loves archetypes, so you know.
Yeah,
but like I will say one thing he said that's the only thing that he said that I think I was like, yeah, well, although I think the way that he framed it is wrong. Like I feel like he made it seem like we should have nuclear. Like I think we've talked about this before. Like absolutely nuclear needs to be part of it. But that's like the only thing that he said that was right. But even the way he made it sound like it's a conspiracy that everyone's against nuclear,
right,
like, that's wrong.
He's right about that part, like about the Germany example. Like he is actually right about that, but he's also framing it in a really weird way that it's like, oh, Germany trying to denuclearize like before they, you know, like when like they didn't really have a backup other than coal was like really bad. It's like, okay, but he's treating that as if it's an argument against taking action on climate. It's like, well, no. I mean, that's actually a separate issue, right? I mean, it's like why isn't this just an argument for like leaning on nuclear as well as other power sources, like as you do a climate transition?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it was interesting, and you could see there at the end that I think Destiny's like trying to set up some sort of discussion about like why, like I don't know what you think, but it sounds like he's kind of trying to get Peterson to maybe see that he's like buying into things like for no reason or something like that he's just like ideologically captured or something, because it's kind of interesting how in response to that he immediately starts talking about like kind of like political polarization and why people start adopting all these strange, like as he called them, constellation of beliefs, however that analogy made sense. But like but I think like it seems like he's trying to get Peterson to maybe see like I don't know how deranged he is or something, or how he's, because so many of the things like, and did you notice how like he immediately wants to go, I don't know, I kind of have this theory about Jordan Peterson. It's not really a theory, maybe it's just obvious that like he's like a broken man of extreme emotion on both sides, and like it's like he's either getting really angry and he starts positing like nefarious reasons and malevolence and like privation and like all these different things, like, or sorry, and like and like predators and like evil intents. Or when he starts thinking about the good stuff, he starts weeping, which maybe will come later in the debate. He'll start crying. And it's just like, and I feel like that's coming through. And I feel like Destiny's just pushing him hard into the anger, the boomer angry uncle. And it's honestly kind of fun to see.
Yeah.
Destiny's maybe I wasn't following, but this is like not that substantive of a point, but Destiny's sort of visual metaphor was kind of confusing to me. Because he initially says like constellation of beliefs, and then he says that they're Jenga blocks where each of them is self-supporting. But it's like, well, hold on, I thought in a constellation there's like connections between the stars. And then he's like, if you pull one out, they all fall apart. It's like, you're supposed to be supporting they're supposed to be supporting themselves. Like now you're saying that they all fall with one of it. I don't get it.
Yeah, I thought his point was exactly that they're all constellation of beliefs. So like they're not really related to each other logically. So if you pull one out, in fact, the rest of them could stay, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think that's what he was trying to say, but he was trying to run like three metaphors at once.
Yeah.
I mean, this is actually, so there was a really good, because I mean, I think, you know, there are more and less charitable ways to take what Destiny was saying at the end, but I mean, like on the more charitable spectrum, I mean, it's end of the spectrum. It seemed like something like, again, I don't really know where he was going with it, right? Because like we haven't quite got him there, but you know, Freddie DeBoer, if you subscribe to his Substack, he had a really good, you know, I mean, I think he could stand to like make them shorter. And you know, I don't know, about a year ago when I imposed a like really strict word limit on myself, which I would recommend for him. But the content is really good. Essay on his Substack that came out yesterday, where one of the points he makes just kind of in passing is that he says something like, you know, progressive social justice types think that you're there, you know, like think that you're their enemy if you disagree with them on one thing, and the new right thinks you're their friend if you agree with them on one thing. In the long term, this is absolutely brutal math for social justice, right? Like, it's like, yeah, that's clearly right? Like, I've seen that play out, many, many times, right? So it's like, yeah, you should be able to, like, I mean, obviously there are beliefs that have entailments for other beliefs, and you could be in their beliefs that are not, consistent to hold, at the same time as other beliefs and whatever, and beliefs that are awkward fits with the principles that are likely to lead you to other beliefs. But like, even accepting all that, right? You could be a little a la carte about this stuff, and to the extent that that's what Destiny was saying, fair enough, right? I think he's basically right. Now, where exactly he was going with that in terms of trying to talk Peterson down from like just the towering inferno of like prophetic rage that he'd worked himself up to at the end there, I'm not sure, but it is also like really funny. And I'm not even saying this as a slam, because I understand that there are, who annoys you and who doesn't, in what ways, and how you react to people is, it's a little much to expect there to be like consistent principles there. But it is really funny to me that I've watched so much lately of Destiny, like having like a really short fuse and being like really annoyed about disagreements, that like watching him listen to like 20 minutes of this like hellfire ranting about how the globalists like secretly want to like, destroy most of the human race. And that's why they're pushing the lie of global climate change. And he's just like, well, I guess I don't really think that. Here's some general thoughts about how political beliefs work.
I noticed that too, and I was wondering if it's maybe a deliberate choice that he's like, I really don't want to blow this. It's like a big person he's been talking about wanting to talk to for a long time. So he probably wouldn't. But yeah, it's true. It's true. I was actually kind of hoping he'd be a bit more aggressive than he's been so far. So
yeah, I mean, it's just really funny, right? Because it's like, normally I think if somebody was trying to like insinuate something really insidious, but they weren't like saying it,
he'd push
like,
them. Yeah,
he would push them like a lot, right? Be like, "What? No, wait a second, you just said something. Like, you said that." And it's like he'd do that for things that are so much milder than it's like, oh, there's something really dark behind this. Like, why don't you tell me?
Well, he might be building. He might be building towards it now, like with his whole, because he's sort of changed the subject to like a meta conversation about how we acquire our political beliefs. So maybe he's building to that. We'll see. Stay tuned next time.
Yeah. Fair enough. Well, yeah. So yeah, got about an hour and 13. So yeah, especially if we do a post game, could really take our time with it next week. So we'll be back then. I hate to leave people in suspense, but we I mean, we know both of these people are still alive, right? So this, it didn't escalate beyond what you just saw. So we will finish covering this next week. I will see both of you for that then. Left is best.